Hi everyone, I'm back to read chapter 3 from Sideways Stories from Wayside School. So far in the first chapter, we met Mrs. Gorf, who is the meanest teacher in the whole school, and she was turned into an apple and got eaten. So the students in that class got a new teacher named Mrs. Jules. And Mrs. Jules thought the kids were so nice that there's no way that they could be children. So she thought they were all monkeys, but at the end of the chapter, they convinced her that they really were students, so it's time for her to get to work. Today, you're going to meet a new character named Joe and Mauricia. So before I read, I want you to think about these and listen for these questions as I go through the story. So I want you to be listening to hear what Joe is having trouble with in school and why his teacher made him stay inside for a recess. And I also want you to be thinking about why Mauricia got in trouble at the end of this chapter. Okay, so chapter 3 is called Joe. I'll show you the picture first. Okay, so remember to think about those questions as you listen to me read the story. Joe had curly hair, but he didn't know how much hair he had. He couldn't count that high. In fact, he couldn't count at all. When all of the other children went to recess, Mrs. Jules told Joe to wait inside. "Joe," she said, "how much hair do you have?" Joe shrugged his shoulders. "A lot," he answered. "But how much, Joe?" asked Mrs. Jules. Enough to cover my head," Joe answered. "Joe, you are going to have to learn to count," said Mrs. Jules. "But Mrs. Jules, I already know how to count," said Joe. "Let me go to recess." "First, count to 10, said Mrs. Jules. Joe counted to 10. 6, 8, 12, 1, 5, 2, 7, 11, 3, 10. "No, Joe, that is wrong," said Mrs. Jules. "No, it isn't," said Joe. "I counted until I got to 10. "But you are wrong," said Mrs. Jules. "I'll prove it to you." She put 5 pencils on his desk. "How many pencils do we have here, Joe?" Joe counted the pencils. 4, 6, 1, 9, 5. "There are 5 pencils, Mrs. Jules." "That's wrong," said Mrs. Jules. "How many pencils are there?" asked Joe. 5, said Mrs. Jules. "That's what I said Joe. "May I go to recess now?" "No," said Mrs. Jules. "You got the right answer, but you counted the wrong way. You were just lucky." She set 8 potatoes on his desk. "How many potatoes, Joe?" Joe counted the potatoes. 7, 5, 3, 1, 2, 4, 6, 8. "There are 8 potatoes, Mrs. Jules." "No, there are 8, said Mrs. Jules. "But that's what I said Joe. "May I go to recess now?" "No, you got the right answer, but you counted the wrong way again." She put 3 books on his desk. "Count the books, Joe." Joe counted the books. 1,000, 1,000,000, 3. 3, Mrs. Jules. "Correct," said Mrs. Jules. "May I go to recess now?" Joe asked. "No," said Mrs. Jules. "May I have a potato?" asked Joe. "No, listen to me. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, said Mrs. Jules. "Now you say it." 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, said Joe. "Very good," said Mrs. Jules. She put 6 erasers on his desk. "Now count the erasers, Joe, just the way I just showed you." Joe counted the erasers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. "There are 10, Mrs. Jules." "No," said Mrs. Jules. "Didn't I count right?" said Joe. "Yes, you counted right, but you got the wrong answer," said Mrs. Jules. "This doesn't make any sense," said Joe. "When I count the wrong way, I get the right answer, and when I count the right way, I get the wrong answer." Mrs. Jules hit her head against the wall 5 times. "How many times did I hit my head against the wall?" she asked. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You hit your head against the wall 10 times, said Joe. No, said Mrs. Jewls. 4, 6, 1, 9, 5. You hit your head 5 times, said Joe. Mrs. Jewls shook her head and said, Yes, that is right. The bell rang and all the other children came back from recess. The fresh air had made them very excited and they were laughing and shouting. Oh, darn, said Joe. Now I missed recess. Hey, Joe, where were you? Asked John. You missed a great game of kickball. I kicked a home run, said Todd. What was wrong with you, Joe? Asked Joy. Nothing, said Joe. Mrs. Jewls was just trying to teach me how to count. Joy laughed. You mean you don't know how to count? Counting is easy, said Mauricia. Now, said Mrs. Jewls, what's easy for you may not be easy for Joe, and what's easy for Joe may not be easy for you. Nothing's easy for Joe, said Mauricia. He's stupid. I can beat you up, said Joe. Try it, said Mauricia. That will be enough of that, said Mrs. Jewls. She wrote Mauricia's name on the blackboard under the word discipline. Joe put his head on his desk between the 8 potatoes and 6 erasers. Don't feel bad, Joe, said Mrs. Jewls. I just don't get it, said Joe. I'll never learn how to count. Sure you will, Joe, said Mrs. Jewls. One day it will just come to you. You'll wake up in the morning and suddenly you will be able to count. Joe asked, If all I have to do is wake up, what am I going to school for? School just speeds things up, said Mrs. Jewls. Without school, it might take another 70 years before you wake up and you know how to count. By that time, I may have no hair left on top of my head to count, said Joe. Exactly, said Mrs. Jewls. That is why you go to school. When Joe woke up the next day, he knew how to count. He had 55,006 hairs on his head. They were all curly. Okay, so now that you heard me read the story, I want you to answer the 2 questions. What was Joe having trouble with in class at the beginning of the chapter? And why did Mauricia get in trouble at the end of the chapter? Make sure to record your answers if your computer will let you. Have fun!